Welcome. You're listening to a Trauma Survivor Thrivers podcast on Mental Health News Radio Network. So much for joining us. I'm Lorilee Binstock, host of a Trauma Survivor Thrivers podcast on Mental Health News Radio Network and anywhere you get your podcast. Today's guest is Babs Walters, a speaker, advocate, as well as a survivor of domestic violence and childhood sexual abuse. And she's also the author of Facing the Jaguar, a memoir of courage and confrontation. Facing the Jaguar is an inspirational story of resilience and courage, a story that proves anything is possible when we claim our truth and shine a light in even the darkest of places. Babs, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Lorilee.
Well, it is Sexual Assault Awareness Month, and I do want to put out a trigger warning we were just discussing because, your story resonates so with my personal story as a childhood sexual abuse survivor. So I do want to let the audience know to kind of listen with care. If you feel like you need a break, you can always pause it and come back to it later, kind of ground yourself. But I do believe this is a very important conversation. It's those hard conversations that are the ones that, we may need to take a deeper look at. So, Babs, thank you so much.
You're welcome. I really appreciate that we're doing this during Child Sexual Abuse Awareness Month and Sexual Assault Awareness Month.
Yes, absolutely. This is a great time to talk about it. Definitely a time we should always be talking about those hard topics. But glad we are doing it now. And so I want to ask you if you would feel comfortable sharing your story and how you started your healing journey.
That's a really big question because you know that I'm a very mature person, so I've had a long time to deal with this. I always say that my story started with my parents, and I'm sure that a lot of people can relate to that because my parents actually got together in a reform school that they were both sent away to. So they were already troubled teens when they were 15 years old. And during their time there, even though they were housed on separate campuses, they somehow managed to get pregnant.
Wow.
I know I was there, but I don't know. I have no memory of it. And they could not get married in New York without parental permission. So they ran away to Baltimore where they were able to get married, except that I spoiled the plan and came before they could do that.
Oh, wow.
And so here you have two teenagers with a baby, and it's World War II, and my father gets drafted and sent away. So my mother basically is a teen with a baby, and nobody knows no one, is in a completely unfamiliar place and all alone. Now, my father got sent to the reform school supposedly because of his anger management issues. And while he was in the service, unbeknownst to whoever made the decision, he was trained to be a sniper. And guns played a very big part in his life, which I'll tell you a little bit more about later. And my mother was sent away because she was promiscuous. I don't think that kids would normally be sent away for those things today, but that was the norm at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And so when my father comes back from service, being trained as a sniper, what does he find in the apartment with my mother and me? Another man. And that sort of began their dance. Him always angry, her always unfaithful. And it was really a hard place for kids to grow up.
Wow.
My mother, I think, was tired of him beating her up all the time. So what she would do when he came home is she would tell him all the things my sister and I did wrong, and things that kids do. I mean, we didn't make our bed, or we didn't do our homework, or we didn't listen to her, or we spilled something in the kitchen. And she would fan the flames till he would get upset. And instead of hitting her, he would hit us. So that's basically how my childhood was. And one day I get my period at the age of 11. At that time, we didn't learn anything in school except for a black and white movie that we saw in hygiene with the birds and bees pollinating flowers. I know school education has come a long way since
Right.
then, but so I was kind of surprised when my father invited me into his bedroom and he began initiating me sexually. What I do remember is that he has guns out. They were laying on the night table and the bullets were that he was shining his gun. And he told me that if I ever told anybody what he did, that he would have to kill me.
Wow.
And with his violent nature and our childhood up until that point, I believed him. Seemed like he could do that, you know. So interestingly enough, I didn't really know what was happening to me at 11. Nobody talked about that. It's hard enough to bring the topic up now, Lorilee. So you know that
Yeah.
we're doing a good deed here. But one day I'm reading encyclopedias because there was nothing left in the apartment to read, and I was an avid reader. And if you ask me what was one of the saving things while I was healing, it was books, because I was able to escape. But I'm reading the encyclopedia and I get to the Incas of Peru and incense, and what shows up next is the word incest. Never heard of it before. Certainly not a dinner time conversation. And I memorized that meaning. I mean, I can give it to you word for word. It's sexual relations between two people too closely related by blood to marry. Nowhere in it did it talk about my terror, the pain physically and emotionally that it was causing me, or the threat to get killed.
Mhm.
So I was really upset and I felt so alone in the world. And I made a promise to myself that day. I said, someday I'm going to write a book so some other little girl doesn't feel all as alone as I felt in that moment. Now, it's taken me a long time, obviously. I've tried a few other times in my life to write the book, but there was always more healing. And
Mhm.
as you know, healing is really a journey, not a destination. So my message to people is never too late. Keep healing, and telling your story is a giant step towards healing.
Wow, what a story! What a story! Just up until then, I know that there's more. There's
Right.
more, but at this point, you knew you feared your father. Did When was it that you actually did tell somebody?
Well, when I turned 14, I made a friend. We had moved, my family moved around a lot, and I was the new girl in school. And the last new girl in school came up to me one day and said, I have a terrible family secret I have to tell you. Can we meet in our secret hiding place and we can do this whole blood sister thing? And of course, in that moment, I thought, gee, I wonder if all girls go through this is some kind of initiation. You know, maybe we're not allowed to talk about it. Finally, someone's going to validate what's happening to me. And sure enough, her story was completely different. Her
Oh,
family secret. And you know something about family secrets is it doesn't matter if people have the same secret as you and I do. Holding secrets for years is a huge burden, and it doesn't really let you heal because it creates a weight in you that stops you and holds you back. So that was the first time I told somebody. Then a couple of years later, in when I was about 16, I had an art teacher who would invite a carload of girls to his home every Sunday, where he and his wife would make a barbecue for us, and we'd sit and they would talk to us about drinking and dating, and they had no children, and they just became like our surrogate parents. And one day I was having a really hard day at home, and he asked me what was wrong, and I told him that, you know, I'm not comfortable talking about it. And he invited me into his office, locked the door after I got in there. And when I told him, proceeded to unbutton my blouse and put his
oh my
hands
God.
in my bra. So I, I can't blame any of these experiences for not telling. I was a scared kid.
Hmm.
I was afraid for my life. And um, I mean, I can talk a lot now, but I was kind of quiet. I was really an introvert. So I held it in until after I got married, and I had never told my first husband about it. We came upon my sister one day and discovered that my father was having sex with her.
Wow.
And we tried to adopt her and get her out of the house because she was younger than me. And we went to see the rabbi who had married us, and he refused to believe that my father was anything more than affectionate. And he said to me, a Jewish father would never do what you're saying, and I can't help you. And
Wow.
yeah, so I went to a female counselor at Jewish Family Services, and I asked her to help me get my sister out of the house. She not only repeated what the rabbi said about Jewish fathers not doing that, she said, though, I think I can help you. You have a vivid imagination, dear. Let's make an appointment. So I started to pick the wrong people to share with. And I don't know
Mm.
about your experience, but every time this happened, I shut down more and more until I could find the right person to talk to about it.
Wow. Of course. Of course. Why would you? And I think that was the fear I had. I didn't want to tell anybody. I think after the abuse had happened to me, I kind of just started going down the wrong path. I was, doing drugs and I was, out with friends and I was doing all the things a bad child would do. I later learned through the book The Body Keeps the Score that these the symptoms of PTSD, of childhood sexual abuse. It was just like textbook. It was like everything that I ever did, but that always made me look like the bad child. I was the bad child, the black sheep, and I nobody was going to believe me no matter what. I kind of knew that. Um, and it was
Plus, you probably were ashamed and
so
felt
much shame.
guilty. Yeah, because I know those were all of the things that shut me down. And you're very special because not everybody can understand this, but as one survivor to another, we know that we don't, we should not have felt guilty or bad or ashamed. But unfortunately, we took that burden on us too with keeping that secret. And that's a hard one to let go of.
Yeah, and I do think the having a caregiver, having your father or biological father, there's like this added layer of shame, I feel, where we do feel like we need to keep it in. We should, like, I was so terrified. I think the first time that I kind of cracked and like told a friend something had happened, I couldn't even say it was my father. And they
Mhm.
were like, "Well, who was it?" I was like, "Oh, I don't want to talk about it." But I definitely didn't allude that to the fact that it was my father. I mean, I just didn't think that happened. And just hearing from my dad, like, don't tell anybody. You knew that there was something very wrong there, and you kind of just
Yeah,
tried to
and you
block
have
it
that
out.
extra layer that you just brought up about wanting to protect your family, be the
Mhm.
good one. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Did you feel Was your mom there to be able to tell? I know that she probably did not create a safe environment for you also.
No, the I spent my entire childhood and young adulthood resenting my mother for not
Mm.
protecting me. I have a, a dream in the memoir of my sister, my mother, and I standing in front of a firing squad. And as the commander tells his troops the orders, ready, they get their guns up, aim, you can hear them clicking, and fire. My mother bends down behind my sister and I and pushes us forward.
Oh.
And that was a dream that I had all through my childhood without actually knowing what I was thinking about. But fortunately for me, I read a book a couple of years ago by Dr. Lindsay Gibson called Adult Children of Immature Parents. And that was the first time I really had to think about immature parenting. I had a 17-year-old unwed mother I mean, who came from a reform school. You want to talk about immature.
Mm.
And what I associated as I was writing the memoir was to get him to stop beating her, she gave him us. To get him to stop having sex with her, she gave him us. Now, what does that say? I mean, I confronted her as an adult,
Oh, wow.
and I asked her, and that's another chapter in the book too. I confronted her, and she said to me as her parting words, "At least you got away." She stayed with him until the day she died. So what does that tell you about somebody? You know, one of my therapists told me that because a woman can have a baby doesn't mean she has a maternal instinct. And my mother clearly did not. She was a child throughout her life. She
Mm.
did not know how to protect us. She only knew how to survive. And that's what she did to survive. So you can't really hate somebody who was that desperate to survive. If I was afraid for my life, she must have been more afraid, because
Right.
I knew at least not to sacrifice my children.
Wow.
So,
Did you you confronted your mother? Did
mhm.
you confront your father?
Excuse me, yes, I did.
Wow.
Not because I wanted to, because my younger sister had demanded a meeting, and um, I felt guilty. Talk about feeling guilty. I felt guilty for not saving her. That it had never occurred to me when I left home that what was he going to do? You know, Um, so I tried to do everything that she wanted me to do, and I resented that too, but I did it. And we sat down with him. That's actually where the coming of age ends in my memoir. You know, our confrontation with my father and what was happening to me that year. And basically, he told us that we were his chattel, that he had the right to do whatever he wanted. And he proceeded to tell us about all the abuse that was put upon him during his childhood. And that if that's what he learned that parents do, then he had the right to do it to us. And finally, when I said to him, "I've been sick for weeks thinking about this meeting and thinking you were going to kill us tonight," I wrote letters to my children explaining why they would never see me again. That's how terrified I was. I was
Mm.
29 at the time. And he said, "Are you kidding?" He said, "Are you going to call the police? What are you going to do to me?" And he started crying and sobbing and slobbering himself all over us. And you know, I think that people that are bullies and people that put on a really tough show are afraid of their own feelings. And that
Percent.
he had something that he was hiding. And he did tell us something in that moment, in that meeting, that I didn't pay a lot of attention to. But after I wrote the book, I did a lot of research into my parents' background, what happened with their parents, what their childhood was like. And I learned something devastating about my father. Um, when he was 5 years old, his mother had a miscarriage. So his grandmother came to stay with them and take care of his mother and take care of him. He was 5 years old boy. And in those days, you bought a chicken from the poulter. It was hanging upside down. It was a full chicken with all its feathers on. And the grandmother was going to make it for dinner, but she had to get the feathers off of it. And the quickest way of doing that was to singe it at the stove. And while she was burning the feathers off at the stove, she caught on fire and burned to death in front of my father. Now, picture a 5-year-old child standing there watching someone burn to death, which had to be a horrifying, I mean, just horrifying experience. And everything that I researched afterwards said that a person that had an experience that traumatic would shut down their feelings, have no empathy for other people. I know you love to talk about empathy, but
Right.
no feelings at all. No, I mean, a sociopath having no idea how they're hurting another person. Now, does that excuse him? Does that make up for what's happened to me or to you? No, but at least it explains. It
Right.
explains my mother and my father. And that helped me heal, because forgiving them has been a lifelong experience for me. But in forgiving other people, any other people, we have more grace to forgive ourselves for that guilt and that shame and that inability to do anything to prevent it from happening. And I feel like they finally gave me a gift in me getting to this point because they were flawed. They were flawed, but I don't have to be.
I am so blown away by the fact that you dug and researched to figure out what had, and then, it seems to have created some empathy, some compassion, like, oh, and not that you forgive him, I don't know if you do or not, but just a better understanding, because I don't know if you've heard me talk about in my past, my healing journey took me through psychedelics, and in my first he psychedelic experience, I saw my father's childhood and the abuse that he experienced, and it all made it I wasn't angry anymore. That really lifted a lot of anger. I don't, some people would say it was forgiveness, but I don't know if I even wanna call it forgiveness, but I just realized it was not my fault, but it was my journey to kind of break that generational cycle. And that is a very powerful, powerful idea, like generations and generations of trauma. I mean, you just went back to what he had experienced, and that is a lot. That is a lot.
Well, I could have written my book about what happened after I was 29, but to tell you the truth, I just kept making a lot of mistakes. And I'm not that famous that people would want to read 7 decades of how many mistakes Babs made. But
I would. I would. You learn from these mistakes and from
I
what you've been through. There's a
But
lot
my
to
objective now was not to write books. My objective is to keep that promise I made to that 11-year-old that someday I would write a book that would help someone else not feel so alone. And if I tell you that every time I do a talk like this, somebody comes up to me and says, I needed to hear that message. You have no idea how weird I thought I was, how strange, how nobody talks about it. And I think when we started out, Lorilee, I said, we need to normalize this conversation because part of the reason that it continues to today is because of the secretive nature of it.
Mhm.
So if we help anybody, even if each one of us just helps one person today feel like, hey, I want to talk about this, or I'm ready to tell somebody, um, then we've done our job. And I have this checklist that I put together called How to Tell If You're Ready to Tell. And there's like 3 stages of how you feel and whether telling is something that you just want to write on a piece of paper, just say it to yourself, or telling is making a recording in your phone, or telling is finding someone who is a friend and compassionate, or a therapist who can help you, or telling means that you want to do something like I did in January of last year, 2024. I told my story for the Library of Congress as a record through something called Brave Voices. And since then, I've become their designated interviewer. So if you or any of your listeners want to record your story for history, I'm your person. And what we would do is the same thing that we're doing right now. Just have a conversation of anything you want to go on the record as saying, and as your healing and your plan to help other people.
Oh, I love that, and I wanna get that information from you so we can share that in the show notes,
Okay.
for folks. But, even for me, as someone who's a childhood sexual abuse survivor with a similar story, I feel like I've learned from you just just from this conversation. But not just that, I feel like you also validated a lot of things for myself. And so you have helped me. So you have
I
helped one person at the very least today, and I haven't even published this yet.
Well, I think we help each other, and I think that that's first of all, sisterhood is remarkable, as you probably have found out already. Um, and not to diss men, because I'm married to my third husband now, and he is the best supporter any woman could have. I mean, this book wouldn't have happened without him,
Oh, wow.
because he's really given me a lot of space to do that. But I think that what's important is that family secrets don't have to be the same secret that you and I have.
Mhm.
I've had people come up to me afterwards and talk about having an alcoholic parent, talking about, I think one of your podcasts that I heard about a disabled sibling and
Mhm.
what that was like. So there are lots of reasons, suicide, that people keep secrets, and we need to teach children the difference between, oh, this is a surprise party. We're not going to tell anybody that secret. Or grandpa says, I'll give you an extra cookie if you'll sit on my lap. That is two completely different secrets.
Mhm.
So nothing against grandpas.
Yeah.
My husband and I have 12 grandchildren. We're
Wow.
grandparents, but we have so much education to do. And I think that the first step in any change is awareness.
Uh-huh.
So we just got to keep talking and find more listeners.
Yes, I do appreciate that. And when you talk about education, it's so interesting because just yesterday I overheard my daughter and her friend, they're just learning about sex education at school. And my daughter was mentioning to her friend, she's like, we were talking about sex education, and the teacher was like, we are not going to use like we're going to use medical names for vagina and penis. And then her friend was like, "Oh, that's so weird. You did that at school." And she's like, "Yeah." And she's like, "Yeah, everyone kind of laughed." And she was like, "Oh, I feel like that's something that maybe your parents should talk about, not like in front of everybody." And I was like, "Actually, I think it's a great way for people to talk and ask questions about it. I mean, it might feel really uncomfortable, but that's just the start, right? If this is part of the curriculum, it'll only get easier the more you talk about it. So that was
Well,
her first day.
I have to acknowledge you for two things right off the bat. The fact that your daughter could say something like that where you can hear her, you're doing the right thing, obviously. Um, I think what also is important is that people have a tendency to feel uncomfortable around certain topics, and not just incest or child sexual abuse. There
Mhm.
are plenty of topics that make people feel uncomfortable. But I always say, imagine how uncomfortable it feels to be abused, to be a child, to
Mhm.
not have anybody to tell. Yes, it might feel uncomfortable for you to listen to it, but it's a heck of a lot more uncomfortable to go through it. So we've got to get the word out there.
Yes, absolutely. We talk about it and we talk about it and we talk about it until we're blue in the face. So then when something happens, we can easily say something. And I read that it took you 70 years. 70 years to really put it out there. I mean, that is a long time to
Well, but
really.
that shows you how much healing I had to do in the meantime. Um,
Yeah.
when I was in my 40s, I actually tried to write a novel. Eh, uh, I was accepted into a program at NYU
Mm.
for novel writing, and you had to send in 3 chapters and an outline, and I got accepted. And one day the professor pulls me aside and he says to me, I think you need to go home and forget about this book. I said, why?
What?
He said to me, even War and Peace has some peace in it. No one's going to want to read how angry you are and how horrible your life was. So it took all of this journey of uncovering my parents and having that empathy for what they'd been through and having children of my own and making mistakes and finally getting it right. Uh, I wasn't ready to write this book. I could write a book anytime, But this
Mhm.
book can only be written now, and that's why it took this long.
That is so that's such a good point because there was so much for you to still learn and for you to teach and share. Because what would have happened at 40 when you wrote your book and there
Oh,
was
what a
so much
book.
to do? It's like, well, wait, how did this end?
Yeah, I know that, like, positioning my story now with my parents being in reform school, that sounds like a Netflix miniseries, you know?
Mhm,
I could not have said that at that time. I was not there. So I think that people really need to allow themselves time in some situations, right?
mhm.
And I don't know if you read the back cover of my book, because the back cover says that the average person can keep a secret for 47 hours, but I kept a secret for 70 years. So I didn't really keep the secret that long because I did try to tell a few people as I went along, and a couple of really good therapists, really good therapists.
That
Um,
matters. That
yeah,
really matters.
yeah. So, I just tell people it's never too late. Keep following your gut, which will tell you when it's time to tell. And if it's time to tell, then you have to put yourself in the right environment, because clearly we've tried to tell people and it didn't work. So that means it wasn't the right time or the right person. And you really have to trust yourself with that.
I do wanna ask, I know that it was after you confronted your father that you started really looking into what had happened to
Mhm.
his in their past. How did you find this information? You're making me want to I did this psychedelic therapy, and I pictured everything in my head, but I want something a little more tangible to research. Like, what did you talk to family members? How did it all come
Well,
together?
one of my therapists told me that the reform school that my parents had gone to was able to
Oh.
find the name of the school. Now, what was interesting in the year 2020, when I started putting the book together, was that the school had been closed for sex trafficking, which is horrible, but that had nothing to do with what it was like in the 30s and the 40s. Now, so I looked up online and I found my father was actually listed as somebody in the school, a student at the
Oh,
school
wow.
for a couple of years. So I couldn't find my mother, but the internet is a huge resource, as you know. Um, I couldn't find out, I found the manifest from my grandparents coming from Europe, the steamship they were on, and I looked up the time that they were leaving and the countries that they left to see if what the conditions were like. And it was between World War I and World War II. And in the towns that they came from, there was a lot of hardship, which I don't know that they actually experienced that, but I got to speak to my grandparents at a certain point when I was younger, and they did share stories with me. My father had a younger cousin, 10 years younger, and when I called her to ask her about the grandmother burning episode, she validated it. She was not present in the room. She couldn't tell me. She said, "Look, I can't tell you if your father had just asked her a question and felt guilty that she turned and caught on fire.
Mm.
I can't tell you if he panicked and didn't know what to do, but I know the entire family talks about the fact that he was standing there when the grandmother died. So whatever I could, like my mother in her story told me that she had something called Saint Vitus dance as a child, and she explained what brought it on. It was a nervous disorder. It has a new name now. They don't call it Saint Vitus, and it doesn't happen a whole lot except for like third world countries. But
Mm.
she was sent to a hospital for 2 weeks. So I got to speak to my aunt, her sister, who confirmed yes. And when she came home from the hospital, she was sent to this private school. So
Interesting.
I confirmed whatever I could with people. My therapist helped me, and the rest was the internet. And then I did something that um, I heard an author talk about one time. She called it perhapsing. She said, when you are telling your story and you have pieces of the truth, but you don't know what happened in between those pieces, you can draw a logical conclusion as long as you let people know that perhaps my father had just spoken to her and distracted her. You know, that kind of thing. I'm not saying that I know that for a fact. So that's how I put the pieces together.
Fascinating. That is fascinating. Wow. Well, Babs, this is such a I find it to be a healing journey that even though the healing journey, like you said, it's just a journey, and I feel like there's some healing I found in this and some things I kind of want to take with me. Um, but I do want to ask if there is anything that you would like to add.
Well, I think I told you what my message is before, that healing is a journey, not a destination. It doesn't end until we end, and that it's never too late to speak your truth. And for me, I think the darkest corner is the best place to shine your light. So you're doing that. So you need to take a bow for that one. But as a Jewish woman, I was taught that it's every Jewish person's responsibility to heal the world. And I just think this world is too messed up for me to like even figure out what to do first. So I'm using my corner of the world to repair it. And that's all the best thing that I can do. And the best thing that any of your listeners can do for me is to get me in front of people to speak. Because writing the book has given me like a full story. I can encourage people that there is a light at the end, that we do get to a point where we can take this, what happened to us, and give meaning and purpose to it by helping others. So that's my repair of the world.
I do have to say, I feel like you underestimate yourself because I feel like what you are doing is healing generations and generations. And imagine you have 12 grandchildren, how healing that is for them to be able to move in the world without experiencing such trauma. I mean, that's significant.
Well, I just
Future
have to give
generation.
I have to give you a funny so that you can leave on a higher note. My sister, who was certainly part of this journey, has chosen to not be part of the book or have her family be part of the book because she doesn't want her grandchildren to know that their great grandfather was a criminal. Now,
Mm.
I think that she's looking at the legal definition of what he did to us, but I think it's much worse to think that these poor kids are not going to know the genetics, that they have a sociopath in their genes someplace. I'd be more interested in that. But this is not about bashing my sister. We're
No.
staying in our own lanes. She's doing what she thinks is right for her grandkids.
Mhm. And then you know what? If they have questions later, they have you. They
And my
have you.
book,
And your book. That's powerful. That is very powerful. Thank you so much. I am so grateful to have had you on and thank you for sharing your story, healing and repairing the world. Um, just one person at a time, that's all it takes. And you have 12 grandchildren to help carry that on. So thank you for everything that you're doing.
and thank you for creating the space for me to get in front of your listeners and for us to, we're going to work together again. I know that.
I would love to. Yes, 100%. Well, thank you so much. That was Babs Walters, author of Facing the Jaguar, a memoir of courage and confrontation. For more information on Babs, where to purchase her book, you can check out the show notes. April's issue of Authentic Insider is out. Check out Authentic Insider at traumasurvivorthriver.com. That's traumasurvivorthriver.com. You can find the past issues of Authentic Insider and past episodes of a Trauma Survivor Thrivers podcast. So if you haven't already, please subscribe to the email list to get Authentic Insider magazine in your inbox monthly. You've been listening to a Trauma Survivor Thrivers podcast on Mental Health News Radio Network. I'm Lorilee Binstock. Thank you so much for being a part of the conversation. Take care.